Hi everybody, it's Sally here, and today I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about tension. Tension is one of those things that can be quite a stumbling block to the new machine knitter, so I'm going to hopefully try and demystify it somewhat and explain a bit about what tension actually is and what we really mean when we say tension, because certainly on our side of the Atlantic, we do tend to confuse gauge with tension. Well, I've just been looking back through some old knitting patterns and knitting books and this, that, and the other, and the British seem to be pretty consistent about referring to it as tension, i.e. knitting a piece of knitting with the correct number of stitches and rows per inch, centimetres, whatever it might be, when in actual fact it should more correctly be referred to as gauge, which I think is the term used in America more commonly than we do it. So most people, not all, but most people come to machine knitting having been hand knitters. So I'm going to try and draw some comparisons between hand knitting terminology and machine knitting terminology, so hopefully it will kind of like put it into context for you. So the majority of hand knitting patterns that you go and buy in a shop tend to be produced by the yarn manufacturers, and so you'll pick up your hand knitting pattern and think, oh, I'd really like to knit that, and so you have a look at it and it will obviously specify their brand of yarn, whatever it might be, and obviously the correct thickness or weight of yarn, whether it's double knitting, 4-ply, Aran, or it might be a fancy yarn. But you know, for the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about standardized yarn weights, and then usually there's a little section in it somewhere along the line that will say, if you want to knit this and have it turn out perfectly, you need to make sure that you're going to use the correct yarn, correct size knitting needles, and if you knit a little tension piece, it'll come out to this number of stitches and this number of rows per whatever it might be. And if you haven't achieved that, I'm just finding this book. Sorry, my focus seems to have gone a bit off. Oh, that looks a bit better. So in this one here, it says tension, 24 stitches and 32 rows to 10 centimetres over stocking stitch on 3 3/4 millimetre needles, 3.75. 22 stitches and 30 rows to 10 centimetres over stocking stitch on 4 millimetre needles, and blah blah blah. Or size needed to obtain given tension. There's their caveat. So in other words, you are meant to knit a little tension piece of knitting to achieve the correct gauge, and once having done that, you can start knitting your piece with impunity and it should turn out the right size at the end. So what are the factors that determine whether that piece of knitting is going to come out right or wrong? Obviously, first of all, there's the yarn. So again, weight of yarn is critical. You know, let's say for example double knitting is usually knitted on 4 millimetre needles, and you know, they'll specify their brand or particular type of yarn, because most UK wool manufacturers that I know of will produce dozens of different types of double knitting yarn for hand knitting patterns, and then it'll give you the tension. So you've got your yarn, your brand, and your correct knitting needle size. So what then is the other factor that's going to determine whether it comes out right or not? Well, the real critical thing that's going to determine whether it comes out right or not is how you hold the yarn, how tight you hold it, and how tight or loose you're feeding it to those two knitting needles as you knit and form each of those stitches. And those are the things that will ultimately determine whether your knitting comes out the right or wrong size. Most hand knitters, myself included, never bother knitting a tension piece. I just barge in there like a bull in a china shop and crack on, and we just hope that it comes out the right size at the end. I mean, I've been hand knitting for a lot of years now, so I know that I more or less knit to tension, and so it would be quite unusual if it didn't come out to size. Unfortunately, with a knitting machine, you can never be quite that certain, because different brands, different types of yarn, different fibres, even different colours of the same yarn will not necessarily produce the same tension or gauge when knitted. And this is where I want to try and differentiate between tension and gauge. Tension, strictly speaking, refers to the tension of the yarn as it's being fed either onto your hand needles or your machine needles. Gauge is the result that you get once you've knitted your piece and you're measuring your so many stitches and so many rows to 10 centimetres. I'm trying to get a bit better at referring to it as a gauge rather than a tension, but you know, old habits die hard, and so I do tend to keep referring to it as tension, tension swatch, tension this, that and the other, when strictly speaking it should be a gauge. So on the knitting machine, what is it that's going to affect your gauge in the same way that it would affect your hand knitting? Well, again, on the knitting machine, if you're following a commercial pattern, it will normally have specified a particular brand and type or weight of yarn. I've got an issue of our UK magazine here, Machine Knitting Monthly, and so I'm trying to find a pattern that uses a specific type of yarn. Of course, needless to say, right at this minute I can't find one. Okay, well, let's go with this one because it's actually a double knitting pattern. So here we've got down here that it tells you what type of machine it's suitable for. Standard gauge machines, this one's particularly using a garter carriage. It says use any soft double knitting yarn, and the colours it's given, and then somewhere around here it should give you the tension. 27.5 stitches and 37 rows to 10 centimetres or 4 inches measured over stocking stitch, tension dial setting at around 9, and tension mast at the loosest tension. So yeah, you need to understand what weights of yarn your particular machine will knit. Obviously, standard gauge machines like finer yarns, happen to have a 4-ply sitting on the machine at the moment for demonstrating in a minute, and most standard gauge machines don't tend to like double knitting. Some do, and the garter carriage is actually a lot more forgiving for double knitting than the standard carriage is. They also like finer yarns than 4-ply, 3-ply, 2-ply, and then if you like using industrial weight yarns, you can buy those very fine industrials and combine them to get, you know, the perfect weight for what you want. Mid-gauge machines, they do knit 4-ply. I tend to find it a little bit loose for 4-ply, but of course they're absolutely ideal for knitting, double knitting worsted weight yarns and some of the fancies that you can buy. They will knit Aran, although I've heard I don't tend to knit Aran on mine because I have a chunky as well. So I'm not too sure what the results are on a mid-gauge for Aran weight. And obviously then the chunky machines, you can start off with double knitting, but again I find it quite loose and the limited number of needles is quite restrictive. But Aran weight, chunky weight, and again the really heavier weight mohairs and slubby cottons and things like that, a chunky machine is absolutely ideal for. So understand what weights of yarn your machine is going to be happy with. So coming back to the tension or gauge, let's say, on your knitting machine, what factors are going to affect the gauge that your piece of knitting is going to come out at? Well, we just talked about yarn. You need to know what yarn you're going to be using. This is a 4-ply. On my standard gauge machine, I would tend to start using my stitch dial at around about number 7 if I'm going to start swatching with 4-ply. Obviously on a knitting machine your needles are all the same size, that's not going to change. The width that they're spaced out remains a constant. That's not going to change. So what is it about the knitting machine that's going to alter the size of the stitches it's going to produce? And it's this dial on the carriage here. All knitting machines have the same arrangement. Brother, Toyota, Knitmaster, they all have a stitch dial, or stitch size dial in the middle of the carriage, which will enable you to select the machine to knit larger or smaller stitches. They start at 0 and go up to 10 with 2 dot increments in between, so you've got quite a wide range of choices of what to select for your stitch size. So how does it actually make a different stitch size? Well, as you knit the carriage across, every time you move the carriage across the knitting, the needle comes forward, it's pushed forward by the carriage, a loop of yarn is put into the open hook, and then the carriage pushes the needle back, and as it does that, it shuts the latch up, and the new loop of yarn that's on the needle here is pulled back through the existing loop that's on the needle, and the new stitch is formed. And so what the altering the size of the number of on the stitch dial is doing is instructing your machine to put more or less yarn into those hooks each time it passes over, and so therefore it's going to make a bigger or a smaller stitch, or a tighter or a looser stitch. So if I rack this up now to 10, it was on 7. And knit a few rows, I'm hoping you can see that start to form there. That if I take that off, it's not terribly noticeable, but these last few rows that I've just knitted, the stitches are quite a lot bigger than the ones underneath it. So that's what's happened when I've changed the size of the stitch that I want to knit by turning this number up on the stitch dial. So put it back to 7. If I turn it right down to 3, it might protest a bit, but we'll see. It has knitted it, but there you can see that it's much tighter than when it was down here on 10 and here on 7. So this dial on here is controlling the size of the stitches as they knit through on your machine, and that is probably going to have the biggest impact on the overall gauge that you achieve when you sample up each type of yarn. So that's one factor. And that is the equivalent of changing your knitting needle size. So if I'd knitted something on 4mm needles and didn't like it, thought, oh, it needs to be a bit looser, I'd up it to 4.5mm. Or if I'd knitted it and thought, well, it needs to be a bit tighter, then I'd probably reduce it down to 3.25 or 3.5mm needles. So the other thing that we said was going to have a big impact on the gauge of your swatch, or how it feels, is going to be the tension of the yarn as you feed it into your hand knitting needles. Now on the machine, it's, you know, as it comes down from the overhead assembly and fed through into the carriage, that is controlled. I'll just tip this up a minute. That is controlled by your overhead yarn assembly. So here I've got my white yarn at the back of the machine. It's coming up through the triangle yarn feeder at the back, and it's coming into the discs, through the tension disc on the back of the overhead assembly, then up through the wire, and then down through the wire at the front, and then down into the carriage. Now from this angle I hope you can see my mast wire is making quite a nice little arc from the back of the machine to the front. Ideally, this is actually a weeny bit loose. I want it to be making that kind of a shape, and this distance here to be about between 4 and 6 inches. And so when I'm knitting and the yarn is coming down, I want the overhead wire to be making this kind of an action. I want to be going up and down as I move the carriage across. If it's pulled right down so that the wire is right down here, and it keeps getting bashing into this one here and keeps getting stuck, then my overhead tension is too tight. And if it's right up in the sky like that and is flapping around all loose, then my overhead tension is too loose and needs to be adjusted accordingly. Now, I don't pay too much attention to what the number says on the dial. I just look at what the yarn is actually doing and make sure that I've got the right amount of tension on that overhead wire. If it gets too loose, you know, this is when you start to get loops at the end of your knitting, drop stitches at the end of your knitting, and uneven tension across the width of your knitted piece. So those are the main factors that are going to affect the tension of your knitting. Oops. As you're working on your knitting machine. So what else was I going to say? What other things can affect your tension? Weights is a pretty crucial thing. So on this piece of knitting, it's only a little piece, and I've got 3 claw weights on there. One on each side and one in the middle, keeping the middle of it down. They're a bit stingy on weights these days when they sell you a new knitting machine. I think they only give you 2 claw weights, which isn't really enough. So if you've only got 2, go and acquire more, because depending on what I'm knitting, I might have anything up to 11, 12, 13 weights across there, particularly if it's something that needs shaping. And different types of stitch will need more or less weight. Lace needs quite a lot of weight. Tuck stitch, I find, likes quite a lot of weight on there. So that can have an effect on your tension. So make sure that your knitting is correctly weighted. The other thing is that we nearly all end up putting ribbing attachments on our knitting, and so we start off with our ribber, and when you put your comb in, you attach these sulking grey weights to the bottom of it. Well, I don't know how much that weighs, a pound, more than a pound. It feels quite weighty. But you don't knit your tension piece, or your gauge swatch as it should be called, with all that weight on it. So once you've finished your ribbing and transferred stitches up to the main bed, take the big weights off. I usually then just put one of the little weights in the middle of the comb. I leave my comb in. You don't have to, you can take it off if you want. But I usually leave the ribber comb in, put one little weight in the middle and then a couple of claw weights on the edges. And then as the knitting progresses up, particularly if the comb hits the floor, I'll then add more claw weights across the knitting. But you don't really want to add masses more weight to that you used when you knitted your gauge swatch, because it can make a difference to the final result. What else can have an effect on it? When you are knitting, you knit a few rows, then you might stop to move your claw weights up. And again, depending on how tight or loose your overhead tension is, once you've stopped knitting for a while, the overhead tension can loosen off a little bit. And again, this is one of those occasions where you quite often find you get loops stuck on the side. So what we experienced machine knitters do is we will hold on to this as we start knitting this row. And then as soon as you feel it bite, we'll let go. And then let the tension of, oops, sorry, not the thing. Let the tension of the overhead assembly take over. Be careful how tightly you hold on to this if you're doing that method. I'm going to see if I can replicate a bad piece of knitting by holding it too tight. And what you might then find is that you've got a nasty little piece of tight knitting on the edge of your work here, where you've held on to that yarn manually and pulled it too tight, or tighter than your regular tension. I tend to find I do that more on my mid-gauge machine, the LK150. I'm an absolute shocker for holding that too tight when I've stopped, and I get these sort of like tight bits of knitting on the side and then have to unravel a row. So that can have an effect on it as well. Holding on too tight. What else can have an effect on it? Oops. That's all right, I've attached myself via my microphone today and I keep pulling the wire. Excuse me. The other thing that will have an effect on your tension is if you change your overhead assembly, the wire thingy up the top of the machine there, those things. For example, if you're using a colour changer, because the colour changer sits over on the far right hand side of your machine knitting bed, and so the yarn has to be tensioned from all the way up there to all the way down to the side here. So the colour changer sticks out sort of like so far off the side of the machine and quite a long way off. And so as a result, the discs on the overhead yarn assembly for the colour changer tend to hold the yarn tighter than the regular mast discs do. So if you've knitted your tension piece using your colour changer assembly, make sure you knit your main garment using it, and likewise if you're going to use your colour changer, make sure you use it for knitting the tension piece. Don't knit one and then change to the other, because you might get a different result. So that's Have I lost it? Oh no, I haven't lost it completely. Sorry about that. I knocked the whole thing on the floor just then. Honestly, I'm a danger to myself. Right, where was I? Yes, colour changer mast. So yeah, if you've done your tension piece with the colour changer mast on, use it for the main body and vice versa. Don't mix them up. So having fiddled around and done all of that, and you've knitted your tension piece, here's your tension piece, and you measure it with the ruler and discover it's not giving you the numbers you want it to. Let me just measure this one. So this one is giving me 29 stitches and 41 rows to 10 centimetres. I've got 29 stitches and 41 rows. So if I was trying to aim for, say, 28 stitches and 40 rows, I've got ever so slightly too many stitches and rows for that. So if you've got too many stitches and rows, it means that your tension piece is a little bit too tight, and therefore you need to loosen it, which means turning your stitch dial on your carriage up and then re-knit the swatch again. I mean, on that close a difference, only one stitch and one row, I might just click it up one dot or two dots at the most and then knit a swatch and then see what the result is. If that was 29 stitches and 41 rows, and I was aiming for, say, 32 stitches and 44 rows, so I haven't got enough stitches or enough rows, it means that my tension was too loose, and therefore I need to tighten it. So I will reduce the number on my stitch dial, turn it down from 7 on a 4-ply, and then have another go, probably turn it down a whole number and knit another swatch and see what the result comes out at. As I say, you know, when you've had your machine a little while, you'll get to know what size you need to set the dial at for the different types of yarn that you're using. So what your starting point is going to be for swatching your yarn to do your gauge. But otherwise, you know, be guided by what it says in your instruction book. But as I say, you know, after a while it kind of becomes second nature. The standard gauge is 2-ply, 3-ply, 4-ply. Mid gauge, double knitting, worsted. Chunky gauge is going to be worsted, Aran, chunky yarn. And there you go. And if you've got anything fancy, you just need to have a look at it. Maybe be guided by the knitting needle size that's been quoted on the yarn band. Most of them should have one. This is a hand knitting yarn. It's specifying needles 2.5 to 3.5 millimetre because it's a European yarn, and it's saying, you know, your tension should be 28 stitches and 40 rows to 10 centimeters. Well, and that's pretty much a standard 4-ply tension to me, or gauge, let's say. So I hope that has sort of like demystified some of what the problems with gauge and tension are all about. I think, you know, new machine knitters, the hardest thing they find is when they want to make a specific pattern is matching the tension. And sometimes it's just not possible anymore because the specific yarn is no longer available. You're using a different brand of machine. It can all make a difference. I mean, I got incredibly frustrated when I first started to knit because it seemed that I could never ever achieve the given tension for a lot of these things. Even when I had a Knitmaster, and when I bought a Knitmaster pattern book, you know, their standard tension was 28 stitches and 40 rows to 10 centimeters, and I could never get the rows ever. And if I got 40 rows, then the stitches were off. So it was a pain in the backside. But if you're struggling with it, if you're within a stitch or two, a row or two, say, you know, tweak it a little bit and have another go, or if all else fails, match the stitches, and then the adjusting rows is much easier to take into account for the length. If you're a million miles away from what the given tension is on your pattern, then you might really need to question whether you're using the correct type of yarn to do it, or if you want to carry on and use a totally different yarn that's going to knit to a totally different gauge, then you know, you'll have to redraw the pattern. I mean, hopefully if you've got a schematic, once you've got your gauge swatch done so you know your stitches and rows, it is easy enough to do. If you have a diagram with dimensions on it, or you can use conversion factors, and I've already done a video in the group about how to use conversion factors to convert it all through. So let me know if there's anything else that I can help with on the question of tension and gauge. And sorry about dropping the iPad on the floor. Bye for now.